What is and isn't a rapier? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton and HEMA as well. Now, recently I've done a bunch of videos looking at rapiers, and one of the questions that's come up in the comments, but also one of the questions that's raised just by the source material itself, is what is a rapier and what is a sword? Well, specifically there I was looking at 16th century, so from the 1500s, English sources. And obviously we're communicating in English here. I speak in English. I speak a little bit of French and I can understand some Italian, and I've studied Italian sources. When we get into other languages, it becomes even more complicated. But what did an Elizabethan or Shakespearean period person mean when they differentiated between a sword and a rapier? Well, the simple answer is we don't know exactly. However, there are some clues. Now, before I get into those, I just want to mention, in the modern world, you will often incorrectly see people refer to fencing foils and fencing épées as rapiers. Now, many people on YouTube, myself years ago in the past, and various other people with similar channels to mine, have made the point these aren't rapiers, these are fencing foils or fencing épées. They're a different thing to a rapier. What I'm holding here is what most people would consider a rapier. We're going to look at a couple of other examples as well. But I want to caveat that slightly with the fact that actually if we look at 19th century sources, which is not normally what we're looking at when we're looking at rapiers, because rapiers are from the 16th and 17th centuries principally, and up to the 18th in the case of Spain, we do actually see the word rapier used for the small sword, and the practice weapon for the small sword is the foil. And in the 19th century, the French invented the épée de combat, which is a form of sharp dueling sword, which sometimes also got referred to as the rapier. So it hugely confuses things. So I want to first state, absolutely, depending on what period you're looking at, a rapier can be any thrusting sword, basically, according to certain usage in certain times. So sometimes in the 18th and 19th century, when they say rapier, they actually mean a small sword, which hugely confuses things. But putting that aside, going all the way back to the period of what we really consider the rapier, the classic rapier of the 16th and 17th centuries, what did they mean when they said rapier as opposed to sword? Well, some people have tried to answer this question by looking at other languages and the origin of the word rapier. I actually think that's not very important. A lot of people have looked at this espada ropera and have associated it with perhaps the implication that it was a dress sword. So if we look at the original use of the word in Spain, then perhaps it meant the sword that you wear with your civilian clothes, as opposed to and as contrasted to the military sword. Now, to some extent, I think that does carry over into England. I think there is an implied difference between a military sword and a civilian sword. And this is really, as far as we can tell, the first period in European history when there is a separation between the sword you take to war and the sword you wear in civilian life. And one of the reasons for that was because it became incredibly socially popular and socially acceptable, and even legally acceptable, to wear swords in Renaissance Europe. And in fact, gentlemen almost felt it their duty to wear a sword. And in fact, we find sources from the time refer to people wearing swords but not having a clue how to use them. They don't attend fencing lessons and they're absolutely hopeless, and occasionally we get into a duel and it becomes a mad shanking fest, and actually, you know, no fencing was witnessed. But the fact is that in this period, people start wearing swords as part of their day-to-day wear. That was not the case in most of Europe for most of the medieval period. For most of the medieval period, for example, if we look at England and France, and certain parts of the rest of Europe at different times under different laws, you weren't allowed, or common people at least, weren't allowed to walk around wearing swords all the time. And even in places where you were legally allowed to, people just tended not to. So even in parts, you know, certain German states where you were allowed to own long swords and messers and things like this, they tended not to walk around in the street with them. Instead, they walked around wearing a dagger. So it's really overall, generally speaking, a thing of the 16th century to start wearing swords. And so in this period, we do see an increasing use of more complex hand protection to protect the hand, the unarmoured, naked hand, which is obviously an easy target in a one-on-one duel. And additionally, we start to see this separation between swords which are maybe just for wearing in the streets versus swords that you maybe carry to war. And we even see, if we fast forward to the 17th century, people like Oliver Cromwell being pictured in a war context wearing one type of sword, usually a mortuary hilted backsword or broadsword, and in a civilian context being shown wearing a rapier, very much like this actually, because this is an English rapier dating to about 1630, 1640. So this is the sort of thing that Cromwell or one of his officers would have worn in a civilian life. So we do see a separation between the civilian sword and the military sword. So coming back to these 16th century sources, therefore, does that imply that there's a difference when they say sword or rapier? Does that imply that there's a difference in the actual artifact itself? And I would argue, yes, it does. So to use two examples, this sword, I believe in those sources would be described as a rapier, although this is a 17th century rather than the 16th century one, but this would be described as a rapier, and this would be described as a sword. This is a basket hilted backsword. Now these are sort of extreme examples, and you can see they've got entirely different types of hilt and entirely different types of blade. They're actually about the same length. They're nearly 40 inches long each, but you can see that this blade is much narrower and much more catered to nimbleness of the point and the thrust therefore, and this is a cut and thrust sword. In a one-on-one duel, the rapier is a lot more nimble and a lot quicker, but obviously on the battlefield, this type of sword is a lot more durable and a lot more capable of dishing out big cuts, for example, from horseback. Now, just staying in the 17th century for a second, if we're looking at sort of an English Civil War or 30 Years' War and the rest of the 17th century after that, this, a lot of people would describe as a small sword because of the style of the hilt. But actually, the small sword comes out of the transitional rapier. So rapiers like this developed dish hilts that became simpler, actually, simpler and smaller and easier to wear. But you'll notice the blades of these are actually not hugely different. Now the reason I picked this small sword in particular, and I am calling it a small sword there, is actually because the blade, you'll notice, is a flattened diamond. It's actually a hexagonal section, but has edges. Now clearly you're not going to cut anyone's leg off with this or head, but it will give cuts to the head and face and neck and hands and arms that are enough to have a serious effect on the target. And you'll also notice that the finger rings, unlike later small swords, are actually fairly large. So if you did want to, I wouldn't necessarily advise it, but if you did want to insert the whole tip of the finger through, like with a side sword, frankly, and certainly rapiers, then you absolutely can do, and that gives you more purchase on the weapon. So while this is a very thrust-centric weapon and has a hilt like a small sword, these types of swords actually already start to appear around 1640, 1650, early forms of them, and are really very common by 1660, 1670. So actually these were, swords like this anyway, were contemporary. You do find what people would classically consider a rapier alongside swords that people would typically call a small sword, but actually if you look at the blades and you look at their proportions, the blades and the way that you can use them are actually not that different. Being a bit smaller, they are a bit easier to wear. So these, I think we can say, are rapiers. Incidentally, I just mentioned Italian language for a second. Some people, because there's so many rapier treatises, look to the rapier or the Italian fencing treatises for any clues on this subject. And you kind of draw a blank because the Italians just call a rapier spada. And if it's a broad-bladed one, they sometimes called it a spada largo, I think. And if it's a sabre, it's a sciabola. And, you know, they've got different words for other swords. But essentially, a straight cut and thrust sword, and bear in mind most rapiers can cut to some extent, is just called a spada. So the problem is the difference linguistically between an arming sword, a side sword and a rapier, they're all called spada. It just means straight sword, which incidentally, of course, épée in French just means a straight sword as well. And an épée in the medieval period is obviously a very different object to an épée in the 19th century. So I think we can say that definitely there's a difference between thrust-centric swords and cut and thrust swords in the Elizabethan age. But What about swords that kind of fall in the middle? In a specifically British context, it's kind of easy for us because you can say a basket hilt, whether it's a mortuary hilt or whether it's a classic English or Scottish or Irish style basket hilt like this. One is definitely going to be described in the source material as a sword, and the other might definitely be described as a rapier. But what about when we get to a actually very popular type of sword like this? What is that? So in the modern world, quite a lot of people out there would go, that's a rapier. However, a lot of HEMA people would go, that's a side sword. The problem with the term side sword is it doesn't exist historically. Side sword is a completely invented, I think probably late 19th century antiquarian term to describe these swords that have a rapier-ish hilt, in other words a swept hilt usually, or forms of complex, early, sort of simple-ish complex hilt, but not always simple actually, some of them are quite complex. But a form of complex handguard married to a cut and thrust blade. And here's the problem, is that this is definitely a rapier, yeah? I think most people would agree. And this is an original antique, this is a replica. This is, most people would say, not a rapier. However, how would they define these in period? And I can only think that it's to do, essentially, with blade width. I think, this is my interpretation, and now this is where we diverge from the source material, or directly from the source material, and we come into interpretation. With any historical source, you're going to have to apply interpretation to get useful data out of it at some point. And my opinion, based on studying the sources for the years, is the fact that in Elizabethan England, so in the 16th century, and you could transfer this to France and other countries, there was a conscious division and separation between what they considered a rapier and a sword. Now, was it simply that one looked more like a civilian sword and was maybe ornate or had certain style of hilt, and the other one had maybe more of a military hilt? I think that's a dubious path to go down. I think, based on my reading of the historical sources, the 16th century sources, is that it was predominantly really just to do with blade width. And I think there's a general tendency, you can basically ignore what type of hilt a sword has got on it. It could have a swept hilt like this, it could have an early cup or dish hilt like this. It could even have because there are types of broader sword which have small sword type hilts on them, épée de soldat in French, or indeed it could have forms of basket hilt, whether it's Scivona or you know, British basket hilt, or whether it's German basket hilts. There are German basket hilts as well. Or things like a mortuary hilt. So there's a whole variety of basket hilts. So you've got basket hilts, swept hilts, cup and dish hilts, small sword hilts, whole variety of hilts. But ultimately, there are examples of all of these hilts married to either more thrust-centric blades or more cut and thrust blades, and sometimes really cut-centric blades, sometimes with saber blades and really broad blades. But overall, the two most popular types of blade that you find in common use in the 16th century and through into the 17th century are sort of average cut and thrust blades, so either double-edged or single-edged, like a backsword, so backsword or double-edged, that have, you know, a fair amount of width to them. And this sword here, it is shorter as well, although I don't think length is necessarily a factor of the division. This sword could absolutely, I mean, it's like a medieval arming sword, absolutely lop limbs off people, but nevertheless it has a swept hilt. So this hilt could be found absolutely, with unaltered, this hilt could be found with a rapier blade like that, and often was. So, essentially, I think in the 16th and 17th centuries, you could choose any blade and any hilt and put them together. Yes, there are tendencies, usually with dish and cup hilts, we usually find more thrust-centric blades, though there are exceptions like the Bilbao broadsword. And usually with basket hilts we find more cut and thrust centric blades and things like this. So there are tendencies, but overall I think my reading of the 16th century sources in particular, but this also applies to 17th century sources, is that the division between what someone wrote when they wrote sword or when they wrote rapier, and remember rapier is a subset of sword, so if they say sword they might be talking about a rapier, but if they write rapier they're definitely talking about a rapier, just to confuse matters. But sometimes in the same passage of text they will say this person fought this person, they had a sword, they had a rapier. What do they mean? Quite simply, I think it means that one person's got a cut and thrust blade with a certain amount of breadth to it, and the other person has a more thrust-centric sword, which sometimes was longer but not always, don't make that assumption, but essentially a thrust-centric sword. And I do think there was an associated tendency and assumption that swords were more often used in war and rapiers were more often used in civilian life, and we also see this in the fencing treatises of the day, for example in George Silver 1599 and his sequel, which is from about 1602, and Joseph Swetnam from 1617 as well. So if we're looking at roughly contemporary English fencing treatises, we also see that division between sword and rapier in their texts. And interesting to note, in Swetnam he often talks about techniques and he says whether you're using a long sword or a rapier. In other words, those are almost analogous, they're almost the same, and you can do the same sorts of techniques with them, but they are different objects. He mentions both of them. So to him, a rapier and a longsword were separate objects. And I think it's purely due to width, and one's a bit narrower and more nimble, one's a bit broader and does more effective cutting as a result. I hope that's been useful and thought-provoking. If you disagree, that's fine. I'm happy to read your disagreements and your logic and your thinking and your evidence down below. If you do agree, if this has taught you something new, again, post below. I hope I'll see you in the comments. Give me a like and a subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.